the rugged west coast of the South Island, pioneering country exploited by hardy European settlers for its gold, coal and timber. Today it's home to an independently minded people proud to call themselves coasters. The Buller is one of the many great west coast rivers. But more than 600 years ago, it carried early Polynesian settlers who went fishing on it and fashioned stone tools nearby. But little is known of how these early coasters lived. Adzes like this one have been found all along the west coast. But this type of stone doesn't come from the west coast, so where does it come from? How did it get here? And how did they make it into working tools? Now, an excavation is giving archaeologists the chance to answer these questions and find out about the technologies employed by the people who first walked these shores. In the early part of last century, the ancestors of Westport resident Charlie Bruning were clearing the forest for farming. But when they started to plough, they unearthed something totally unexpected. A beautifully shaped stone adze, unlike anything they'd seen before. Evidence they were not the first people to use this land. But what the Bruning family didn't know is that this impressive stone adze and others the family have since uncovered are from the earliest time in New Zealand's human history, known as the Archaic phase. This was the time when the ancestors of today's Māori were first settling this land. And like many ancient communities, they've left behind tantalizing clues about where and how they lived. The fact that some early Polynesians ended up on the rugged west coast has always intrigued archaeologists, so much so that a team from Otago University has set up camp near the mouth of the Buller River. Carter's Beach is just southwest of the Buller River mouth. For the past 2 years, in collaboration with the Historic Places Trust, a team led by archaeologist Richard Walter has been excavating this archaic river mouth site.
This site is right at the beginning of the New Zealand sequence. There are sites of similar age in other parts of the country, but this site has the potential to answer a lot of questions that have been left unanswered from these other sites.
The team are excited because they've excavated the foundations of several small dwellings, along with cooking and tool-making areas, discoveries that will help them visualise the lives of these early settlers.
We've never before had the opportunity to open a site of this age, and really this is what makes this site so special to us. We're going to be able to, for the first time, catch a glimpse of the way of life of these people within the community in which they were living.
But Richard faces several questions. Who exactly were the people who first lived here? How did they live? And where did they come from?
We believe that the people who were living here could easily have come from East Polynesia themselves. It's more likely that their parents or grandparents were born in the tropics. Most of my career I've worked in tropical Polynesia, and this site looks just like something that could have come out of the Cook Islands, Tahiti, French Polynesia.
To understand whether these early Polynesians landed directly from their Pacific homelands or worked their way to the west coast from elsewhere in New Zealand, we need to look back to the time when the first people arrived on these shores. Archaeologist Janet Davidson has made a lifetime study of the prehistory of the New Zealand and Pacific cultures.
They were Polynesian people related to Cook Islanders, Tahitians and so on, and they came from some one or more of those islands in what we call Eastern Polynesia. And the push down to New Zealand and up to Hawaii were the two sort of ultimate adventures that some of those people undertook. Well, it would have been a total and utter shock, firstly because it's so huge. We have to remember that the islands they came from were tiny. Rarotonga's about the size of Wellington Harbour. and something this big was unimaginable. And the climate was really tricky for people who'd had thousands of years of living in the tropical Pacific.
Just imagine what it must have been like for the very first people to step onto these shores. This is what they would have been confronted with. Unsure of what they would find, they would have brought stone tools, domestic animals and tropical plants with them. Whoever they were, they certainly had a lot to contend with, an uncompromising landmass and creatures that were totally foreign to them. But this cool new land would prove to be surprisingly abundant, with strange and giant flightless birds, along with plentiful fishing resources and seals. Just the sort of environment to explore, and explore it they did.
And what we know now is that people arrived in New Zealand and they explored very rapidly, and they explored with a very fine geological sense. They knew what they were doing. They understood rock. They understood, even coming to New Zealand and working with sources they'd never seen before, they recognised the potential very, very rapidly.
While moving through the country, these Polynesian explorers manufactured tools from the various stone types they found along the way.
At a very early stage, they'd carried out New Zealand's first geological survey.
Carbon dating from previous excavations puts the arrival of Polynesians in the South Island as long ago as 700 years, perhaps even longer. Some groups settled on the east coast, where more resources were plentiful. Vast numbers of Moa bones, along with stone flakes used for the cutting of Moa, have been found in and around these east coast settlements. Archaeologist Dan Witter has studied the techniques early Polynesians used to flake stone to make an effective cutting blade.
They would strike this point on the anvil and detach a flake, and you can see that sharp cutting edge, which was probably used for a lot of different things, but one can imagine that it would certainly be capable of cutting whales and moas.
For a time, Moa were plentiful on the east coast, but previous excavations show scant evidence that Moa was a big part of the diet of those who settled along the west coast.
Heaphy River mouth is the furthest north we've been, and the site looks virtually identical to this. It's got thin band of occupation with extremely dense and varied assemblages of artefacts, and the artefacts there are virtually identical with the artefacts here.
The fascinating thing about this Buller River site is that rock from several sources throughout New Zealand have been used in many of the tools manufactured here.
We're finding chunks of Mare Island obsidian, and that's very, very unusual in South Island sites. We're finding argillites from the Nelson mineral belt, huge quantities of this, big blocks of this, and thousands of flakes where people have been taking material and banging off their adzes, making their adzes. So this is a manufacturing site as well as a living site.
But this raises the intriguing question of why and how these early communities got hold of this material.
Are we dealing with exchange networks that are spanning the country, that is with the comings and goings of small numbers of people perhaps moving objects and raw material around? Or are we talking about large groups of people just coming in with outsourced material and setting up? We don't know the answer to that.
But what he does know is that these West Coast excavations are giving him a valuable understanding of tool manufacturing processes. In the lab, I caught up with postgrad student Amy Findlater.
So this is from Otago, Canterbury. This is from Nelson, Marlborough. This is from the Bay of Plenty. Most of the rest of it is local to the Buller River mouth or West Coast.
Yes.
So it came from all over the country. What does that tell you?
Well, it tells us something about the movement of people, or the movement of these raw materials, and because Bulla is an archaic site, it's probably one of the earliest in New Zealand, already people have came to New Zealand and they've found all of these stone resources that are important for everyday life.
But this Bulla River site is providing an unusual challenge for the team. A key ingredient needed to interpret their social structures and to accurately date the occupation is missing. An excavation near Westport is providing archaeologists with links to our first arrivals from Polynesia and revealing artefacts that date from their earliest settlements. But a big piece of the puzzle is missing, leaving them to look for other clues.
Usually on sites like this we find extensive middens, shell, bone, etc. to tell us how the people were living, but on this part of the west coast the soils are terribly acidic, so there was virtually no organic material at all. We're having to concentrate on the artefacts themselves, the fish hooks and that sort of thing that tell us what people were catching.
To build the big picture.
To build the big picture about economic activities.
At the end of each day, the students log and sort through the hundreds of adzes, flakes and fishing lures retrieved.
What are you doing here, Patrick? You're obviously doing freehand drawings. Why?
Yes. In my case, I'm working on stone abraders, and abraders are grinding tools. We've got a grinding stone here, and files and abraders are essentially the same thing.
You would have taken something over and ground it down on the stone? Is that why the grooves
Yes,
are
you've got 3 different grooves there for different shaped objects, for example, like here, here and here.
Right. Yet with these tools you'd have picked them up and used them on an implement, is that right?
Very much so.
But new evidence of just how extensive this tool manufacturing was came to light when Amy Findlater made a remarkable find. She uncovered a cache of greenstone adzes that clearly illustrate the earliest techniques they used with the stone. And after a blessing by Ngāti Waiwai, Amy could then examine in more detail the significance of her once-in-a-lifetime discovery.
So this was the very first adze you ever found?
Yes.
And so who found the others? Who found all these?
Yeah, I did.
You found a whole lot of them? And you said that all 4 of these are the same. Why is this one, if it's nephrite like the others, why is this one a different colour?
Nephrite has a lot of different properties, and lots of different colours are found, from these pale greens to the very dark colours.
This is the standard green that you expect of greenstone.
I suppose that's the typical example that you find in greenstone shops.
And beautifully polished as well.
But these early Polynesian settlers had little experience working with this rock.
They couldn't work it by the techniques that they were used to, and if you would know if you find a boulder in the Arahura River, you don't necessarily know what's inside it, but they recognised the properties of the stone and learnt how to use it.
You have to wonder, don't you, how our earliest inhabitants were able to come here and with the most basic of raw materials like this rock was somehow able to fashion working tools. Well, here at the University of Auckland's Māori Studies Department, Dante Bonica shows just how adaptable they were. Dante is a master adze maker and one of the most knowledgeable people in New Zealand when it comes to pre-European tool-making culture. He's demonstrating how they would have shaped a stone adze using a hammerstone, usually a cricket ball-sized basalt rock. This system of tool-making has been in use for hundreds of thousands of years by stone tool-making people all around the world. Slowly, the rock is reduced by progressive flaking until the basic shape of the adze begins to form. This process may take less than an hour. And then a finer percussion technique and hours of abrasive rubbing turns what was once just a chunk of rock into a finely balanced tool. Dante then hones the blade using a sandstone. Stone tools like this one were relatively quick to make, although greenstone adzes could take hundreds of hours. They were harder than steel and kept their very sharp edge. Oh, let's look at this. Ooh, that's keen. Razor sharp. Yep, it's working. The variety of adzes found at the Buller River site suggest they were used for housemaking, wooden tool making, and for canoes. But it's the quality of the tools that is surprising Richard.
This adze, for example, it's what's known as a reverse triangular adze. It's found on the site in the workshop area, adjacent to the hammerstones that were being used to manufacture it. And it's actually only an hour, a couple of hours away from being finished. It's a very finely made adze, the height of the adze making industry in New Zealand.
Fishing was probably the major activity for our early coasters. Using a flint drill bit, they would have used this technique to begin crafting a bone fishhook, later shaped and polished to its final form. At the Buller River site, little bone has survived the ravages of the acidic soils, but the team are finding plenty of other evidence of Polynesian fishing prowess.
This is a minnow lure that we found today. Now, we know that this particular one was being manufactured on the site. It's still got the scraped marks where they've been working it. Hasn't been finished. All of the other ones that we've found on the site have been finely polished. So this is very close to the last stage of manufacture.
These lures are classic Polynesian design, with grooves at the tail end used to secure the bone hook, while a string arrangement ensured it trolled behind a canoe, and it proved very effective.
Oh, they're very much indigenous to New Zealand, but what makes them particularly interesting to me is that they're based on an East Polynesian design.
While early Polynesian settlers had the wherewithal to find raw materials to make tools, they couldn't have survived without one other major ingredient. The first Polynesian settlers brought their fire-making techniques with them, and fire-making implements were prized. Dante is using mahoi, one of 3 indigenous species perfect for the art of fire-making. In the right hands, it seems to take almost no time at all before there's smoke. And you know what they say? Where there's smoke, there's usually fire. Hey, we have fire. We can eat tonight. Brilliant. Hey. There you go. Fire would have been the key ingredient for comfort and survival, especially in West Coast weather. But the remains of these ancient fires would prove a bonus for the archaeologists working on these archaic sites. Despite little organic material to carbon date, the earth ovens contain charcoal that can be carbon dated. Now Richard is confident he has an accurate fix on when the site was occupied.
Well, the radiocarbon date so far suggests that it's in the middle of the 14th century, so we'd say about 13 to 1350 AD.
The pieces of the puzzle are slowly falling into place for Richard and his team. Evidence of tool manufacturing using stone from various parts of New Zealand suggests the people who lived here were 2nd or 3rd generation settlers who travelled to the coast from other parts of the country. But trying to determine how they lived in this place so long ago is another thing. However, the recent discovery of post holes and earth ovens is providing the first look at how these people housed themselves and organised themselves socially.
But in archaeology, mostly what we understand about the villages, the social structure, the way of life, is reconstructed from the features that we see in the ground, and this is usually just the remains of the houses, which might just be post holes, patterns of post holes on the ground, the ovens, the working floors, places where people were sitting down and banging up stone, that sort of thing.
650 years ago, this site was a lot closer to the shoreline. These computer-generated images show Richard the results of his work in a proper context.
We believe that it's going to be a very promising way of visualising what these sites are like, and from that trying to understand something about the way of life of the communities.
Up to 15 extended families could have lived here for months at a time, and they would have lived well, with the ovens used for the communal cooking of moa, seals, and even dogs.
I think that the ancestors of the Maori people who landed first footfall on this shore did a fantastic job of exploring the country, getting to know it, naming it, discovering what was valuable to them in it, and learning how to use the resources sensibly and practically.
This archaeological excavation at the Buller River mouth has shown just how adaptable these early Polynesian settlers were. Through the work of Richard's Otago University team and the Historic Places Trust, we're slowly learning more and more about the little-known lives of the first coasters.